Daddy's Little Learner, Chapter 13, The First Client. I kept running back to Dad and letting him hide me from the authorities for days or weeks on end, not realising that I was playing straight into his hands. He continued interfering with me, and finally succeeded in achieving full penetration over the course of time. I couldn't pinpoint an exact occasion when I lost my virginity fully because it hurt so much every time. It was while I was with him on one of these escapes from school when I was 13 that he must have decided the time was right for me to start earning him money, now that he had succeeded in breaking me in himself, and he knew just how he wanted to get me started. He had a friend called Peter, a big, fat, smelly, Irish drinking companion, who spent a lot of his time working away from home, probably on the oil rigs in the North Sea. Peter always had plenty of cash in his pocket, no one to spend it on except himself, which made him a tempting target for Dad. When he and Dad were together, they would always drink heavily, and I dare say Peter was buying most of the rounds. One night, I had run away from school and gone to find Dad as usual. He welcomed me back and took me out drinking with him and Peter. At that time, he liked me to buy vodka and limes, and none of the pubs we went to ever said anything, even though they must have known how young I was. I was used to getting drunk with Dad's friends. I'd been doing it since I was 8 or 9, when I used to drink whiskey and orange and play cards till all hours of the morning in our front room. So I had no reason to be particularly suspicious of their motives that day, any more than any other. At the end of the evening, they wended their way back to Peter's flat, with me in tow, picking up a Chinese takeaway on the way. It was a horrible, dirty, dingy flat, the sort of place you might expect to find a wino living. But I was too drunk and hungry to care much about my surroundings. Just being with my Dad was enough to make me happy. I settled onto the settee and opened up the Chinese. However many vodkas I'd put down that night, I was still sober enough to put up a fight when Peter started making a clumsy and unwelcome pass at me. Men had made unwelcome passes at me before, and I was confident I could keep him at bay, especially with Dad there to protect me. I'd seen Dad beat up enough people to be sure that dealing with a fat, drunk Peter wouldn't give him any trouble. I hoped Peter would take the hint and give up before Dad lost his temper and beat him to a jelly. The next thing I knew, I was grabbed, thrown off the settee, amidst flying Chinese food cartons and pinned down on the floor. My head suddenly cleared with a shock, and I realised Dad was holding my arms back to allow Peter to screw me. My father wasn't going to fight to protect me, because he'd sold me. I struggled, and I shouted at them both to get off me. "Shut up," Dad screamed, apparently furious that I was showing him up like this by making such a fuss. There was nothing I could do against the strength and weight of 2 grown men, and eventually I gave up, even trying. "Relax," Dad instructed as always, "because it's going to happen. You're not going to get away from it, so just get on with it. The more you relax, the better it will be for you." I turned my head away so I didn't have to look at their faces, as Peter did what he wanted to do, and I stared hard at the overturned cartons and the spilled Chinese food on the carpet that had seemed so appetizing just a few moments earlier. All I could think was that this was all I was worth. This was what I was reduced to, laying amidst the rubbish, being used up and disposed of like cheap spilled food on the floor. This was all my own father thought of me. I somehow felt more violated than I ever had when Dad had done it to me himself, because Peter was a virtual stranger, and because he was so disgusting physically. Dad always told me he was the only one who loved me, so I could be bloody sure Peter had no feelings towards me whatsoever. He just wanted some quick relief and a bit of underage action. Because they didn't exchange any words during the whole scene, I knew that they must have planned it before, that Dad had pimped me just as he had pimped Mum and Kathy and all the others. I knew Peter must have paid, because I was sure Dad would never have given me to another man for free. He was always jealous of me even having a boyfriend. But somehow that didn't seem to matter when there was money to be earned. I had become just another dodgy little business transaction to him, a bit of a cash cow. And Peter was no threat to his own power or control over me. "You shouldn't be giving it away," were the exact words I'd heard him use to women 100 times before, "when you could be charging for it." I knew that he genuinely had difficulty understanding why every woman didn't go on the game. In some ways, I think he believed most of them did, one way or another. He always said that married women who didn't work lived off their husbands and provided sexual favours in return. He didn't think that was any different to openly selling your wares to different men on the street. Many years later, when I had been moved to another children's home, Peter used to send me money from time to time, even though I never had sex with him again after that first experience. Maybe he had a conscience after all. But Dad certainly didn't, because from that night onwards, he saw me as a permanent source of income and started taking me up the block to work just like Mum, leading me deep into his own personal world. The first night I worked on the block, I was on the run from break. I think Dad had just come out of prison for something and had encouraged me to come and see him. We couldn't go to his flat to stay because that would have been the first place the authorities would have gone to look for me, so we went to Lucy's and Twiggy's place. Twiggy was Lucy's on and off boyfriend for years and was a lovely old boy. Even though I was scared about what Dad had planned for me that night, I felt comfortable being with them. They made it seem like it was all just a normal day's work. I drank an awful lot of vodka before we went out in order to get my courage up. Most prostitutes have to be drunk or high in order to deal with the fear of being out on the street, especially when they're starting out. Afterwards they drink more, because they want to drown out the memory of what they've just done. Which is why there is such a culture of alcohol and drugs around the business. I didn't know anything about drugs in those days, and that was one thing Dad always said he was totally against. He thought he was too good for the dirty, scruffy hippie scene of the time. That night Dad told me what to wear and supervised me painting my face, and then he took me out to Burr Street. I just felt an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. There was no way out of it, so I might as well get it over with. I obeyed him automatically in robot mode. "Walk up to the car when it stops," he instructed. "Open the passenger door and ask, 'Do you want business?' If they say, 'Yes, how much?' you say, £7 in the car or £10 at the house." He stayed in the shadows behind me, pushing me towards the cars as they slowed down, whispering encouragement as I wobbled forward on my high heels, fueled up on vodka and lime. It was frightening, but it wasn't exactly difficult. If a car containing a single man was cruising in that area, it was certain that he was looking for the one thing I was selling. "Do you want business?" I asked the first one. Terms were agreed, and I got in the car, and that was it. I probably managed to service 4 or 5 punters that first night. I don't have any clear memories of the men or the sex, just a sense of total revulsion. Did these men have any idea that I was only 13? Would it have mattered to them if they did? Surely there was no way I could pass for 16, even in the dark. But no one stopped and said, "You're too young, darling," because they all wanted a piece. Dad had bought a bottle of whiskey to take back to the house after I'd earned my money. Relieved it was all over and I had survived, I swallowed several glasses in quick succession and then threw up all over his suit trousers. The whiskey probably didn't mix too well with the vodka still swirling around in my stomach from earlier, not to mention all the adrenaline that must have been coursing through my body. I thought Dad would kill me for spoiling his clothes, but he didn't even get angry. Just seemed to think it was funny that I got myself into such a terrible state. He was always good at helping people when they were drunk or ill or had been beaten up. Whenever one of his friends like Lucy turned up on the doorstep in a bad state, he would always take them in and do whatever was needed. Whereas most people might think they had brought such things on themselves, he would think it was perfectly understandable. Maybe he knew that at vulnerable moments like that, he would be able to turn people into anything he wanted. Make them prostitutes or alcoholics, make them dependent on him and grateful to him for not judging them. He liked people to think he would always be there for them, no matter how badly they behaved. If I was drunk and throwing up, I was easier to manipulate and control. "That's life," he said cheerfully as he cleaned my vomit off his trousers. We stayed at Lucy's and Twiggy's for a few days that time, but the police must have got wind of where I was because they came looking for me to take me back to the children's home. When they heard the police at the door, Dad and Lucy hid me in the cupboard under the stairs. As I sat, scrunched up in the dark, I was hoping the police would find me and take me with them because I didn't want to go out into the streets anymore. I felt ready to return to the safety of the home, but I wasn't going to call out and give myself away because I knew that would upset Dad. Pleasing him was always the most important thing, so I stayed silent in the darkness, under the stairs, my heart thumping, watching the passing shadows through the cracks in the boards, listening as the police checked all over the house, but didn't even bother to open the door I was leaning against. I listened to them finishing the search and leaving the house with mixed feelings. From then on, I began to work on the block regularly. While I was working, Dad was completely in control of everything I did, and he loved it. Every night he would decide what I would wear and how I should paint up my face. Once he knew I had got the hang of it, he would leave me out on the pavement to wait for business while he disappeared into one of the nearby pubs, where he was a well-known face, popping out every so often to check on how I was getting on. He didn't need to be there much after the first few times, because he had taught me exactly what to do. Occasionally, I would take men back to Dad's flat, but mostly I worked in the cars. The routine was almost always the same, and the whole transaction never took long because the guys had always got themselves so worked up by the time I got into the car that the actual act was all over in a few seconds. Most of the turn-on for them was the risk of coming looking for a prostitute in a dangerous area, of slowing down the car and talking to us, the bus of the unknown. They enjoyed the thought that they were walking on the wild side of life, the side where people like me and my dad were laying in wait for them. There was a little lane in a nice village just outside the city ring road, which was where most of the men would drive as girls once they picked us up. It was well known for being a sort of lover's lane, with cars parked up in all the little nooks and crannies as the business was done. If there were too many cars there already, or the police were parked there watching what was happening, then the punter would have to drive on and find somewhere else to do the business, like an empty multi-storey car park. They usually seemed to know where they were going, unless they were from out of town, when they would need some suggestions and directions. Most of the customers seemed the same to me. I guess they were businessmen, always clean, polite and well suited, driving posh, shiny company cars. If someone rolled up to the curb in a battered old van looking a bit rough, we would tell them to piss off, and they would have to go to one of the other streets, where the girls could afford to be less choosy. The drive to the location was usually the most frightening bit of the operation, wondering if they would stop, or would they go, or would they turn nasty when asked for the money. Nearly all of them were fine and acted in exactly the same way, but every time I got into a car with a stranger, I knew I was putting my life on the line, because there was always a chance that this would be the sort of madman or sadist who got his kicks from battering or strangling or stabbing girls like me. Once the punter had found somewhere to park, he would hand over the money. Then there would often be a row about condoms. Every client always wanted to do it without, but I was never willing to do that. Not only did I not want to get pregnant, but I had also been living amongst prostitutes for long enough to know about the dangers of infections and sexually transmitted diseases. I'd overheard Lucy and Gail discussing it often enough. Sometimes the guys would offer silly money like hundreds of pounds to be allowed to do without, but I was never tempted. Some of the more desperate girls who had drink or drug habits to finance would probably be more easily persuaded. I guess the punters are a bit more used to the idea of condoms these days, but in the late 1970s, no one knew anything about AIDS, so there wasn't the same level of caution. I would never do blowjobs either, having hated it so much when Dad made me do it to him. So it was nearly always just straight sex that I was selling. Once the deal was agreed and the money exchanged, I would tilt the passenger seat back as far as it would go and slide my knickers off. By that time, the punters would be absolutely desperate for it, and often nervous about being caught at the same time, which added still more to their fumbling haste and their level of excitement. They would struggle out of their jackets, undo their trousers, and roll over between my legs. I would then stick my feet up on the dashboard, and it would all be over in a matter of seconds. A few minutes later, I would have wriggled back into my knickers, pulled the seat up into its normal position, and we would be driving back to the block. Usually, I could be out on the pavement again, readjusting myself and getting ready to approach my next customer within a quarter of an hour of getting into the previous car. I was supposed to give every penny that I earned to Dad, but once he got used to me being up there, he became bored and started disappearing into one or other of the pubs. He would then reappear less and less often and had less and less idea of what was actually going on. Once I was more experienced. I would do a couple of punters while he was away, and when he came out and asked how business was, I'd tell him there hadn't been any yet, keeping the money well hidden. I'd also put my basic price up to £10 without telling him, so I could keep back some for myself. At that time, I was the youngest girl working on the block, and the older woman didn't like me being there, stealing their punters. But they wouldn't do anything about it because they knew Dad was around and looking after me. There were quite often fights amongst the women, especially if girls from other towns tried to muscle in. I knew that if I hadn't had Dad's protection, I would have been given a hard time. But then again, if it hadn't been for him, I wouldn't have been there at all. Dad gave me a little skewer attached to a ring that I wore on my finger, saying I could use it if ever I needed to defend myself. The skewer was cradled in the palm of my hand, ready to swivel round onto my knuckles in a dangerous situation. But I never actually found the courage to use it. If I tried to use a weapon like that, I think I probably would have come off worse than the encounter, and I could have even ended up dead. I became more confident about the way I dealt with punters over time, but I never lost that fear that the next stranger whose car I got into would be the one who murdered me. Although I tried to pick my customers carefully, it wasn't always possible to sum someone up accurately in the few seconds between opening the car door and getting in. There was one occasion when the moment I climbed into the car and closed the door behind me, I had a bad feeling, even though it was still daylight, a time when everything normally felt safer. The guy at the wheel looked like one of my normal everyday punters, but once we were driving, he told me he didn't want to go to the lane where I usually went, and drove instead to a new location in the middle of nowhere. He had taken control of the situation in a way that made me uneasy. I said nothing, already sensing that he wasn't someone to mess about with, and knowing from dealing with Dad, when he behaved like this, that it was important not to aggravate the situation. When he eventually stopped the car and I asked for the money, he brushed it aside. "Later," he said. But that was a golden rule that Dad and Lucy and everyone else I knew in the business had always drummed into me. Always get the money up front. As I was beginning to feel a bit scared anyway, I used his reluctance to pay as an excuse to call the deal off, and fumbled to get out of the car. The moment my fingers touched the door handle, he pulled me back into the seat with all his strength and smacked me hard in the mouth. I knew then not to argue or fight anymore, just to give in. Years of experience with Dad and his tempers told me that this was a man who didn't care how much damage he inflicted in order to have his own way. I knew that if he was willing to act like this right from the start, then he might be prepared to do far worse if I didn't cooperate. I could tell that he didn't see me as a person at all, and that there would be no chance of appealing to his better nature. I know it seems odd to claim that I was raped, given that I was selling sex, but that's how it felt. I hadn't given my consent to it, and yet he did it anyway, leaving me feeling violated, cheated, and furious. I said nothing, just waited for it to be over, and hoped he wouldn't really turn nasty afterwards. Once he'd finished, he nicked whatever money I had in my purse before pushing me out of the car door, flinging my bag out after me and driving off, leaving me in a heap on the side of the road, scrambling around on the ground for my scattered possessions, every last scrap of human dignity gone. I was so hurt and angry. I wanted to report him to the police or talk about it to someone. But what was the point? I was an underage prostitute, on the run from a children's home. What chance did I have of getting any sympathy from anyone? I knew from things I'd heard the other girls saying that I was lucky to have got away as lightly as I had. In the end, all I lost was my money and my dignity. But I could have ended up beaten to a pulp, or even dead. I was arrested a couple of times for soliciting, but because I was underage, I just received cautions. That was always Dad's trump card when persuading me to do anything illegal. The fact that I was too young to be prosecuted. The police were nearly always looking for me anyway because I was known to have run away from school or from some children's home or other. One time, I was cautioned for carrying an offensive weapon when a policeman noticed the skewer on my ring. Strangely enough, some of the police seemed more concerned about the worry I was causing my father than about the damage that was happening to me. One time I was picked up by a policeman on Burr Street who knew that not only I was in care and underage, but I was also a ward of court. I knew this man was a friend of Dad's. Dad had recently been beaten up for some reason, and this guy seemed to know all about it. You do cause your dad a lot of problems, the policeman tutted as he drove me back to Dad's flat. He was talking about Dad as if he was a sweet old man who couldn't understand why his delinquent daughter was the way she was, rather than the man who had instigated and encouraged everything I had ever done wrong in my life. On the way there, he stopped off at the fish and chip shop to get something for us to take for Dad's supper, to cheer him up, as he puts it. The only explanation I can think of why Dad was allowed to get away with as much as he was because he was a grass. But there is no way he would ever admit to such a disgraceful thing. In the sort of circles Dad moves in, pimping your underage daughter is one thing. Grassing to the police is quite another.